Oh, thank you. Okay, it's my Everything is Beautiful, an exhibition focusing on the work of Alma W. Thomas is currently in view at the Phillips Collection until January 23rd. So if you haven't seen it, by all means, please make every effort to go and see it. It's a wonderful show. And in conjunction with the Phillips, other cultural and educational institutions across Washington, D.C. have partnered to celebrate Thomas's life with a variety of events, honoring her contribution to D.C.'s cultural heritage. Among these many organizations are the National Gallery of Art, Hirshhorn Museum, the National Museum of Women in the Arts, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and Howard University, where Thomas earned her BA in Fine Arts in 1924. Alma Thomas was most known for her large-scale abstract paintings that celebrate nature, astronomy, and space travel. Yet Thomas also created many works on paper as studies and finished works of art. Today's presentation examines these innovative experiments on paper that informed and inspired her lifelong research for beauty. So it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Gwendolyn H. Everett, also known as Gwen. She is an art historian, museum educator, children's book author, and an associate professor in art history in the Department of Art at Howard University in Washington, D.C. She formerly served as Associate Dean for the Division of Fine Arts, Director of the Howard University Gallery of Art, and Chairperson of the Department of Art. She received her PhD from George Mason University, and she also holds a Master of Arts in History from Howard and a Bachelor of Arts from Spelman College, where she majored in studio art. So please join me in welcoming Gwen Everett. Thank you.
Thank you, Beverly. Thank you for that very warm introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you and members of the Washington Print Club this morning to briefly talk about one of Washington's jewels, Alma Thomas. Many of you on the call might remember Alma Thomas. Some of you may have actually known her as an artist, an arts educator, an arts administrator, an innovative abstract artist. That means that she's not a stranger to you. You may know of her relationship to the city that she called home for most of her life, her relationship with the Washington Color School artists. Although she's linked with this group, she was not a member of the group. She was friends with many of them, Gene Davis, whose work is on the screen, Kenneth Nolan, Morris Lewis. She's also very close to Sam Gilliam, who speaks about and fondly remembers visiting her, actually drinking with her, and doing errands for her. Gilliam, those of you on the call know, was known for his iconic drape paintings, these very large, almost iconic images that spoke about the ways that artists were transforming not only art making, but also how one could see and experience art. Gilliam, who took the canvas off the stretcher and draped it in and around spaces, as this installation at the Corcoran shows, he even placed some of his works out of doors and on the exterior of buildings. Some of you may also link her with the artists who were working in New York, the Spiral Group, Norman Lewis, Romare Bearden, and others. They were interested in making political statements using abstraction. This is Lewis's Harlem Turns White, that some believe talks about gentrification. Also, Norman Lewis's Processional, 1965, based on, it's believed, the protest marches at the time, and particularly the March on Washington. Alma Thomas also created a sketch based on the March on Washington, which is shown on the screen here. So she's similar to, but very different from, these other artists. Unlike the spiral artist, Thomas actually attended the March on Washington. Unlike the spiral artist, Thomas, however, changed her view and was never very political, although she supported activist causes. So, in a way, again, she's similar to, but different from. She didn't ignore racism by not participating, but she fought against it. She fought against it through education, through community service. And in the writings of several of the more recent historians, the note is made that she claimed space for herself as a woman artist, as a Black woman artist, even though she didn't refer to herself using that term. One could say that her activism was spreading beauty. Thomas is known to have said over a number of occasions, almost as if it became a mantra, I've never bothered painting the ugly things in life. No, I wanted something beautiful that you could sit down and look at. Through color, I've sought to concentrate on beauty and happiness rather than on man's inhumanity to man. In some respects, those have made relationships or compared her statements, I should say, to that of Henri Matisse, the French artist who also used beauty and color in his abstract pieces. Matisse is said to have mentioned, and this is a quote, what I dream of is an art of balance, of purity, of serenity, devoid of troubling or depressing subject matter, an art which could be for every mental worker, for every businessman, as well as the man of letters. For example, a soothing, calming influence on the mind, something like a good armchair, which provides relaxation from physical fatigue. Matisse was criticized for making that statement because when he made it, it was during the time of the Nazi invasion in France. Some saw him as retreating from the world around him, trying to create a world of beauty when things were literally falling apart. Thomas, however, was far from retreating from the world. She always flung herself headlong into it. She was a devoted educator, as I mentioned, arts administrator, an innovative artist. And as Beverly pointed out, and I'm hoping that many of you have had a chance to see, that her work is the focus of an installation, traveling exhibition, I should say, Alma Thomas, Everything is Beautiful, that was co-organized by the Chrysler Museum of Art in Norfolk, Virginia, seen in this installation shot, and the Columbus Museum of Art in Columbus, Georgia. The exhibition is in DC just for a few more days. I didn't have anything to do with organizing it, but I think it's a stunning show, and I'm hoping that many of you who've not had a chance to see it will do so. The exhibition is a tribute to Thomas. The accompanying catalog is a wonderful resource. It provides new interdisciplinary research about her, and much of what I will share with you today comes from some of that new research, along with conservation studies from the Luce Conservation Center at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. And incidentally, Sam is organizing an exhibition in 2023 featuring their works by Thomas. In fact, Thomas was very involved with the, which is now the Smithsonian American Art Museum, during her lifetime, and bequeathed several works for that collection, and they are featuring those works in that exhibition. So what we know of Thomas is that she was a woman who was known to be very much concerned about beauty, not only beauty in appearance, but beauty in action, beauty in a performative sense. So in looking at this portrait of her, I'd like for us to just start by thinking and perhaps pondering, who was she? Who was Alma Thomas? Who was this paradigm of elegance that many speak about. And in fact, in this work, we get a hint about her. Also, I'd like to refute the view of her being a late blooming artist. We'll talk a bit about that in a bit. And the fact that she was very much active in many artist groups in DC at a time when the city was very segregated. She was active in very integrated circles. So this portrait of Alma in 1947 by a fellow female artist, Laura Wheeler Waring, in a way captures who she was and how she presented herself to others. It's been described as a portrait that captures the artist as a woman of decorum and refinement. She's bejeweled, note the bracelets that she's wearing and the earrings on her earlobes. Her hair is perfectly coiffed in this updo, her arms are crossed, very elegant, very self-composed. Waring depicts Thomas in this dignified, assertive manner. Her direct gaze, crossed arms communicate a formidable presence that informs the title of the likeness. She doesn't title it Alma Thomas, but you probably have noticed, as it's been on the screen now, that the title is Portrait of a Lady. So in lieu of naming it after the sitter, she calls this work, or makes perhaps a gendered statement. The designation of lady engages the politics and aesthetics of respectability, kind of code of ethics, code of experience, and a code of expectation. Black middle-class women often negotiated within domestic, professional, and community relationships in this kind of code of respectability and enduring kind of this awareness of your actions, how you interact with not only individuals in your race, but definitely as a response to segregation, racism, and threats of white supremacy. Thomas was often seen in this guise of respectability. This is a studio photo portrait on the right of screen now, and one sees the portrait that she lived with on the wall behind her. She's holding a book, in a sense, as a reference to not only her being an educator and a learned woman, but it's also a book by Cedric Dover that included her among the abstract artists who were working at mid-century. So what we know about Thomas is a kind of deliberateness, that she was attentive to how she presented herself to others. We see this even in the opening reception of her exhibition, her solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of Art in 1972. She wore this very bold patterned dress for the opening that almost mimicked the patterns in her own paintings. She was the first African-American woman artist to have a solo exhibition at the New York Museum. On the occasion of the opening, she spoke to the New York Times about her journey, saying, quote, "When I was a little girl in Columbus, there were things we could not do and things that we could. One of the things that we couldn't do was go into museums, let alone think of hanging our pictures there. My times have changed. Just look at me now," end quote. And look at her on the right screen with a fellow artist and friend, Delilah Pierce, at an exhibition opening at Gadsby Tavern in 1967, where both of them are sporting these fur coats. So what I'd like for us to do now is think a bit more about Alma Thomas, who she was, how she became this artist whose life and works still resonate so much to us today. She was the eldest of 4 children. born of John and Amelia Thomas of Columbus, Georgia. She was born September 22nd in 1891. By 1890, her parents had become the first known African-American couple to own a home in Rose Hill, which is a neighborhood in Columbus. They lived at 419 21st Street on a small rise of land, which was between wealthy white families in a kind of antebellum homes on top of the hill, and poor white workers at the bottom of the hill. Her father, John Harris Thompson, was a successful businessman who owned a liquor store at the time called a saloon. And her mother, Amelia Canty Thomas, was a school teacher and became a dressmaker after her marriage. So what we know about the family is that they were well-to-do, middle class, they were well educated, and as we see from this portrait done about 1888, were also conscious of appearance, of decorum. Her father stands with his hand gently on the chair. Her mother is presented in a hat, in her finery, in a very Victorian image. In an autobiography that Thomas wrote a little bit after 1966, she recalls her childhood in Rose Hill, that neighborhood in Columbus, Georgia. This is a vintage postcard of it about 1910 from the collection at the Columbus Museum. She talks about how at the time that the community was rightly named because roses bloomed there almost year round. And she singled out two circular flower beds on the property as being so preserved in her memory and her subconscious that the paintings that she produced later reflected their influence decades after she had actually seen them. Within the home, her mother and her aunts participated in groups that Alma termed cultural clubs, likely patterned after Chautauqua model that became widely popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Chautauqua Literary and Scientific Circle, known as the CLSC, was founded in New York, in upstate New York in 1878 as an extension of the original Chautauqua Institute, still exists today and touts itself as the oldest book club in America. Originally designed as a 4-year course of directed readings, the SLSC focused on two goals: quote, to promote habits of reading and study in nature, art, science, and in secular and sacred literature, and to encourage individual study to open the college world to persons unable to attend higher institutions of learning. Well, actually, Thomas's mother, Amelia Canty Thomas, and many of her siblings had graduated from Tuskegee Institute, which prioritized practical and vocational education over liberal arts courses. So it's believed that participating in the Chautauqua Homestyle course, that the Cantys and their friends read works from English literature, home study course, and that they read about ancient Greece and about Rome, narratives on European and American history, treatises on art, history, and the Western world, topics that they may not have been exposed to in many white and even many in many whites and many Black colleges at the time through their course of study at Tuskegee. The family archive actually includes 4 of the 5 books assigned in the 1897-98 course reading material, and those books were donated to the Columbus Museum's collection. Other cultural events that occurred at the home included art club meetings, lessons in paintings on velvet, as Thomas talked about her mother being proficient in that, friends who actually gave lessons to the family in painting, musical performances. Her mother played the violin. So we have now a sense of this family and how important education and the arts were to them. We also know that things were very different as things progressed near the turn of the century for many communities in the South and even in the North. Jim Crow laws became increasingly more restrictive. Thomas's father's business became a sort of victim of these laws. Violence against Blacks became more prevalent. And the family then decided to move. They left Georgia. Thomas was at the age of 15, she had completed ninth grade, which was the highest grade available in public education for Black children in Muskogee County until 1930. She and her sister, John Maurice, often told a story about when they left the South and moved north, and when they entered the District of Columbia, that their mother instructed them to take their shoes off, shake off all that Georgia sand out of them, and don't look back. Again, remember, this was a time of strict discrimination and violence against Blacks in the South. And the family now becomes part of this migration, later called the Great Migration, as many Southerners moved from the South to the North. And they followed a practice that was very common at the time. Amelia's sister, Sally Canty McDuffie, who was living in DC, offered that DC was a safer alternative for where they were living at the time. It offered more educational opportunities for the children and helped the family with the purchase of a house, as you see here on the screen, the Thomas's home that was located at 1530 15th Street in Washington, D.C. Not long after selling their home in Columbus, they moved to D.C. in 1907. Amelia Thomas left with her children, and the father or the husband moved later in 1908. So the step migration that many families followed, we see was very much a part of the Thomas family. This house was built in 1875. It was 4-room home. A detached house is listed on the National Registry of Historical Places in DC, and also on the historical site and part of the African American Heritage Trail. As you can see the placard here. Thomas noted that when she attended school in Washington, she was a student at Armstrong Manual Training School. And she said, which many of us as educators wish that some of our students would declare, she said, going into the classroom was like being in heaven. That when she went into this classroom, which was a new trade school, which Armstrong was, that she entered the art room, as I mentioned, as if she was entering heaven. She took all the art courses there, as well as sewing and millinery and cooking, and that, quote, it laid the foundation for her life. She continued her training at Minor Normal School, which was the school where teachers received their teaching certificate in DC, and she too earned that degree. She later went on to teach at Princess Anne schools in Somerset County in Maryland. She was later accepted a position at the Thomas Garrett Settlement House, which is considered or described more as a hybrid community and social service agency in Wilmington, Delaware, where she stayed for 6 years. So when she returns to DC and becomes a student at Howard University, not only is she a mature student, she is an educator, but she comes with the desire to study costume design. And here are some of the studies that she created as a student at Howard. in 1922. She arrives in 1921. She was 30 years of age when she enrolled at Howard, and her work caught the eye of the then chair and founder of the newly formed Department of Art, James V. Herring. Herring had established the art department in 21 and realized quickly that not only did he need teachers, but he also needed students. So he recruited Thomas to become the first, or among the first students in the art department. And one can see her talent. These are photos of some of the costumes that she designed. And just to go back quickly, her ability to render these very beautiful historical costumes in the in watercolor and ink seen in these images. So she is recruited by Herring, and we see some of the things that she creates as a student. These are, this in fact on the screen, illustrations for the University Annual, the Bison or the Yearbook, which was published in 1923 when she was a student. And here she shows an image that's an illustration for the sorority section of the yearbook. She also continued to improve as an artist in creating works in ceramic and also plaster sculpture pieces, as the work on the screen demonstrates. This work is titled Bust of a Young Girl. It's believed that she used her young sister, Fanny, who's seen in this photo from about 1903, 1904, with her sister, John Maurice, who's the younger sister in this work. Fanny was about 7 years old when this photo was taken. She died young, and Thomas's work commemorates her sister in the Bust of the Young Girl piece here that she created, modeling after, it's believed, her sister. It bears similarities. It's a little bit hard to see in the photo, but you might note the bow that you see in her hair, the curls as you see that frame her face, and even the dress that she's wearing, kind of ruffles that appear in the plaster bust. Her teacher was May Howard Jackson, and it's thought not only is she working with Jackson as her teacher, but also picking up on Jackson's style in the way that she renders, again, the hair and the dress that her sister is shown in this work. The work in photo here, that's part of the collection at the Columbus Museum of Art, that the notation on this photograph, you can see her with the sculpture bust, says that this was her first sculpture bust that she created as a student, which again attests to not only her skill and ability, but the way that she's able to capture in the sense of realism in the work that she's producing here. The family records contain very little about Fanny. It's thought that she died of diphtheria, but her face as well as her memory became, or was very much a part of the family's recollections. Thomas kept the bust that she created of her sister in her bedroom, and it had a very prominent place there until her death. When she graduated from Howard, the Bison yearbook included a photo of her. This is not a very good picture. You can see she's actually in the left of the photos here at the top of the page. Underneath the information about each student, it described them, who they were, what their majors were, And what she says as her sort of statement here is, and quote, what is more far reaching than beauty? So this concept about beauty is something that really is persistent in her thinking, in her working, in her attitudes about life, and in the way in which she sees herself and how she wants to present herself to others and her work to others. After graduating from Howard, she accepted a position as an art teacher at Shaw Junior High School. And I see that there's a question or a comment in the chat. I'm not sure if that is something. Okay, someone is saying that some of the slides are not very clear. I apologize for that. And I'm hoping that some of them will become a little bit clearer as we move through. So she becomes a teacher at Shaw Junior High School. This is a photo of her with two students at the Howard University Art Gallery, that she continued to have this link with Howard, that she would bring her students to the gallery to help with their experiential education outside of the classroom. We know that in the classroom, she created an environment for her students that was thought to be a haven for them, that she covered the walls and the windows, allowed the students to actually paint on the paper that covered the windows, kind of creating almost a kind of stained glass window appearance in the classroom. One of her former students says that he remembers that she had flowers in the windows. And in fact, Jacob Kanan, who was a friend of hers, recalled that as well, and that it was one of the most beautiful rooms in the school. She told her students not to look out the window onto 6th Street, but that their future actually existed in the classroom, what they were learning and how they were learning to prepare themselves to go out into the world. She continued her interest in theater when she received her master's in teaching from Columbus University. Her master's thesis was on marionette productions. She collaborated on theatrical productions with her students, and seen in the photo on the right. She even studied under America's premier puppet master, Tony Sarg. So her interest in theater continued. You see in the photo on the left, her actually with some of the marionettes that she created. One is in fact in the exhibition that's traveling. So we find then an image of an artist who is very multi-talented and has multi-interests, that she not only frequents performances in Washington, but she's well-traveled. She goes to Europe, she travels cities here within the US. She is also very much involved in the arts as an art administrator. She, along with James Herring and Alonzo Ayton, created the Barnett Ayton Gallery. She was the vice president for this venture, which was housed in Herring's home on Randolph Place, Northwest. The Barnett Ayton Gallery was one of the first African-American owned private galleries in the country. It was very progressive in its curatorial practices and approach. The gallery exhibited a host of modern artists, local and national, Black and white, and attracted a racially integrated audience. This is a work, or the work on the screen, I should say, that shows the first gallery in the Barnett Ayton Gallery, produced by John Robinson, Washington artist. We also know that she was very active in artist groups. This photo shows her in the group that Lois Jones created, called the Little Paris Group, in Lois Jones's home, that allowed for local artists, local teachers to come in and paint and to critique and exhibit their works. She was continually interested in improving herself as an artist, as an individual, as a lifelong learner. She took classes as an adult now. We're now well into her art practice and training. In the 50s, she enrolled in graduate art courses at American University. She took classes with Ben, nicknamed Joe Summerford, with Robert Gates and Jacob Kanan, very well-known artists, abstract artists in Washington at the time. She, as the others, experimented with abstraction and color, bold abstraction, the aesthetic elements as we see here with the bold patterning, look very much like Hans Hofmann, and artists who were creating these abstract works again at mid-century. However, when she retired from teaching, after teaching at Shaw for 35 years, she was no longer then beholden to formal classroom teaching, and she began to devote herself full-time to painting. It was also at this time, after she retired, that she was invited to have a retrospective exhibition at the Howard University Gallery of Art. The cover for the catalog is on the screen now. Alma W. Thomas, a retrospective exhibition from 1959 to 1966 was the title for the show. And she was invited by Porter, James A. Porter, who was the director of the gallery and head of the art department at Howard at the time. He was a fellow student of hers when she was in that class in the early 20s. In fact, he was the second graduate of the program. So there was not only a friendship, but sort of this relationship between them. The exhibition offered her an opportunity to show past work, but similar in fashion to Thomas, she decided to also show new work. Now, at the time, she was 75. She was suffering from arthritis, and she felt that this also would offer her an opportunity to move past some of these health issues. And she created 16 new work as a part of this exhibition, which historians have calculated that meant that she probably created an average of 4 paintings a month leading up to the opening of the exhibition, which was in April of 1966. Many of the new pieces that she created show a new style that she had turned to. This is a photo of her with Herring at the exhibition's opening. This is a photo of her with Albert Carter, who's the curator of the gallery at the time. But note the image that she's standing next to. It shows strokes of color that she's placed in a fairly regular pattern in what some described as sort of blobs, daubs of color. Eventually, they became known as Alma's stripes. There were 34 works exhibited in 2 galleries. The checklist for the exhibition described the works in different media. Some were watercolor, some were oil, some were acrylic, which had become a very popular medium for artists at the time because it was very quick drying. And it was probably something she turned to also because of health reasons. She says about the work that she created for this exhibition that she wanted to do something new, that she wanted to do something different from anything that she'd ever done, and different from anything that she had ever seen, that she thought to herself, that must be accomplished. And she described looking out the bay window in her living room at a holly tree. And she reportedly said that she wanted to capture then the light flickering through the leaves of the holly tree. And I'm quoting one thing that she said about it because it became this kind of muse for her for many years. And she said, "This tree, I love it. It's the one who inspired me to to do this sort of thing. The composition in the bay window reached me every morning, the colors, the wind, who in their who is their creative designer, the sunshine filtering through the leaves to add joy." So she met this challenge that she posed for herself, developed a style that became uniquely her own, and she created these wonderfully patterned works using daubs of color, color placed against color, color sometimes over top of color, using irregular, sometimes rectangular, intense daubs of color inspired by nature. This one is titled Alma's Flower Garden, seems to visualize the garden that was behind her home, personal memories of the gardens of her childhood home, the sort of pattern work in the garden, the sculpture pieces seen in her backyard garden, the paved walkway that creates a kind of circular design that appears in many of the works that she creates, even when she titles them as this Spring Flowers near Jefferson Memorial. So that not only was there personal gardens that she was emulating in her work, but also gardens in the nation's capital. This kind of action of creating and producing things that were important to her and yet new and different at the same time. She worked in her kitchen studio. This is a photo of her. You can see that she was not a very tall woman and in fact had to reach and stretch and move the canvases around to be able to reach the works that she produced, because many of these were large scale, not traditional easel size works. And although they're called Alma stripes, you can see the stripe design in the work here, um, that they create, or they seem to have a kind of element of spontaneity, of kind of motion and natural motion. But we know that her works were produced using a very regimented procedure, creating almost a kind of preciseness in the work that a preciseness that underscores the work that she produced. Here's a photo that was taken of her in her studio. And in fact, it says that she's here composing some of her earth paintings, these paintings that deal with images that relate to gardens and wind and trees and flowers, that she's composing a painting using cut and tape studies, that she's adhering them to this primed stretch canvas. And it's hard if you notice here that in her hand, that she's actually holding a roll of 3M masking tape in her right hand, as she's holding up the study for the work in her left hand. And this is attested in some works that survive, as this one that's titled Untitled. And you can actually see the masking tape pieces along the bottom strip of the work, and actually the strips that she's placed together to create, or at least to form then, the study for the final painting. So Thomas taped, and conservation efforts show that she may have actually pinned these studies to the surface of her canvas. This is a detail of a painting that's part of the Hirshhorn Museum Sculpture Garden, where if you take a look here in a section such as this, and over here, if you can follow the pointer, that there are indentions in and punctures in the canvas that suggest that she may have pinned the studies onto the surface while she was working on this painting. Note also that she used graphite, and that she would line and outline places where she wanted the paint to be applied. sometimes painting over them, and sometimes actually leaving the lines there on the surface. She went further in her attention to detail and this kind of precisionness in creating her works in this painting titled Mars Dust from 1972, which is part of her imagining space travel, what it may have been like for the astronauts to go up into space and see the Earth from space, and what it may have been like on the other planets as this image of Mars. And she talked about how she created this work, because she was asked to create a kind of questionnaire when this work was seen. And she described that she purchased strips of elastic. Those of you on the call who may have been dressmakers or seamstresses at one point, or perhaps still do so, if you remember that the elastic that would come in packets, if you could purchase them as she did at, say, in department store notions section, or if you go to a store that sells dressmaking materials, that she thought of her mother, who was a dressmaker, and kind of used this idea of these elastic strips that you could place, or she placed over her canvas and stretch them around the canvas as a guide, initiating these stripes as she painted the work, moving the elastic across the image. And I'm quoting, she says, "I use a yardstick each time I move the elastic band. The yardstick checks the inch top to bottom. And if I have a correction to make, I place the rubber band around the canvas again, and the in and the stripe, so that she's moving this up and down and creating these very precise stripes across the canvas using that type of a pattern that gives the flexibility because it's elastic, but it also stays in place because of the tautness of the elastic band." Looking further at her works, that it seems as if that she made these kind of preparatory under drawings in pencil until about 1971. And some of these, as we saw, you can see with the naked eye. And the conservators at the Smithsonian American Art Museum doing additional work using infrared reflectography have been able to see some things that the eye cannot see. And in looking at the screen here, this is a work that's titled Snoopy, Early Sun Display on Earth from 1970. And the detail of the infrared photograph on the right shows us how she used not only vertical lines with the very fine pencil line that she's applying, that she used a ruler, she used protractors, and she creates the space where she wants the paint to be applied, literally rendering this kind of guide that creates this kind of very, very, very strict underpainting for her. Her paintings later, or perhaps early, may not have been created using these kinds of guides, but her failing eyesight, her arthritic hands may have motivated her to try these new methods, and providing her with these kind of new and innovative ways to create her work. During the summer of '74, she fell and broke her hip, was hospitalized for more than 4 months. Images of her at public events show her often in a wheelchair or using a walker. Multiple sources testify that she further adapted her painting technique during these years so that she continued to work despite her inability to stand for long times or to hold a paintbrush. Jacob Kanan, for example, revealed that at the end, she literally wedged herself between her table and her canvases that allowed her to be able to stand or even to sit because she was so weak at the time. It was during this time, however, that she painted one of her largest compositions, Red Azaleas Singing and Dancing Rock and Roll Music. This, I think, might give you a hint that not only did she like music, and even the title of the exhibition, the retrospective exhibition that's traveling, Everything Beautiful, is subtitled, or the subtitle for it comes from a song that she loved and admired. And here, the idea of rock and roll music and dancing and singing, the exuberance that's captured here in this work. It's a triptych. You might be able to see the divisions here in looking at it, and also how the work literally kind of dazzles the eye, even though it's pared down with just red on a white background. The work was the highlight of the solo exhibition at New York's Martha Jackson Gallery, the fall of 1976. By that year, she had stopped using the kind of straight edge or bands of elastic to guide her compositions. Her columns of paint were replaced then with kind of wedges, if you can see in looking at this design, kind of blips and shapes that are formed by the brush, kind of arranged in almost kind of tile-like pattern, spaced a bit more loosely across the canvas. She seemed to have sketched many of these compositions beforehand, working on pre-designed designs. And there are numerous examples of these shapes and patterns in watercolors that appear in paintings such as this one. She increased her reliance on watercolors more as a guide, and going back even to the image of her in front of the painting behind her, you might be able to see the watercolors that are on the table in front of her with the many brushes and containers on the table in front of her as well. So despite the fact that she's ill, despite that she's very weak, despite that she's challenged with health issues, that she continued to create these very bold and imaginative works despite her challenging the challenge in mobility at the time. During the final months of her life, she was further weakened by a degenerative heart ailment that frequently kept her in bed, but she continued to paint. It's noted in her biographical information that even when she went to Howard University Hospital for heart surgery, that she carried with her art supplies that she wanted to continue to create even in the hospital. She died in 1978 after heart surgery, and she was 86 years old. She defied conventional norms. She defied conventional expectations. And even in her death, she defied the norm. This is a photo of me at the White House in 2016. Those of you on the call know that the Obama administration acquired a work by Thomas, making her the first African-American woman to have a work in the White House collection. The work was unveiled in 2016 by First Lady Michelle Obama, who invited to the White House local art historians and art history students for a series of programs around the unveiling of the family dining room and the work that was acquired by Thomas titled Resurrection. She devoted her life to advancing the lives of Black students, her neighbors, her commitment to education, her embrace of abstraction, even in the 60s, was not a withdrawal from the urgencies of then the movement. but in fact, a new way of representing a new art for a new era. And even in this new era, her work, White Daisies, Rhapsodies from 1973, hangs in the office of the Vice President, Kamala Harris, another woman of color who has achieved many firsts, first to be elected to that office, who's also a Howard alumna. And in closing, just as a bit of a reminder, Thomas, who's loosely kind of connected to the Washington Colorfield painters, but was not a member. Her large-scale paintings that celebrate nature and astronomical phenomena and space travel. Her career, even during her lifetime, was marked by many firsts. First student to graduate from Howard University, first African-American woman to have a solo exhibition at the Whitney Museum of Art. But her life was very impactful as an educator, an administrator, an innovative abstractionist in the city that she called home, that still resonates today from her persistent search for beauty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gwen. That was fabulous. And as one of our commenters has to say, Linda Miller says, wonderful lecture. All these details have helped me to understand and appreciate the artist and her work so much more. Thank you so very much.
Oh, well, thank you. That's good to hear.
Yes. So if we have any questions, you can also raise your hands if you prefer to just ask rather than type it into the chat. Chris has one.
Gwen, let me, the question that popped to mind was, given her deep association with Howard University, was she at all influenced by Elaine Locke?
Actually, in a way, Thomas kind of she kind of precedes Locke, but also overlaps Locke because she's there in the 20s. It's just at the beginning, in a sense, of the Harlem Renaissance that we think of as the 20s and the 30s. So she's aware of Locke, Porter and Herring, Lois Jones, James Wells. She's aware of them. But one of the things about Thomas, and it's picked up often in reading the catalog, which is this interdisciplinary look at her, that speaks to the fact that she was her own woman. That unlike some artists who were influenced by Locke's writings and teachings and in fact shaped their work based on Locke, she didn't feel the need to do that. She didn't try to fit in with the Black arts movement artists in the 60s and 70s in terms of painting works that spoke to social issues using realism and figurative imagery. She was very comfortable in who she was. She was very comfortable in the work that she was doing, although she's constantly learning and taking classes and talking with artist friends and being parts of, these different groups, both Black and white. But in looking at her and reading about her, she's never swayed from this view that I'm not going to produce work that is, disturbing or is difficult. I'm going to present things that make the world feel better. And in a sense, I'm in, this is what I'm doing, this is where I'm staying, and these are the works that I'm presenting, that I'm producing. In a sense, she's a very strong-willed woman, because some artists felt they had to please collectors, they had to please patrons, they had to please critics. She doesn't seem to have been that type of artist at all.
I'd like to ask a question.
Mhm.
What was Alma's relationship to David Driscoll? Because David Driscoll's
Oh,
show was
thank
also at
you.
the Phillips. And
Thank
I
you,
thought,
thank you, thank you,
yeah,
because I can't say I struggle with that, but I had him in and I had him out and I had him in and I had him out because they were very good friends. Driscoll wrote the sort of catalog description. Now Herring wrote the intro, Driscoll wrote um, the descriptive part of the catalog when her works were seen at Howard in that exhibition, the retrospective. They were friends because of as a student, Driscoll worked at the Ayton Gallery. So they knew each other for years.
uh-huh.
And Driscoll included her in his, major blockbuster, mind-changing exhibition, 2 centuries of Black American art, including Thomas in that, not only elevated her profile as an abstract artist, but it also meant that individuals who at the time could see her in this larger pantheon of artists from colonial to 19th century and into the 20th century. And Driscoll was very instrumental because the show that was organized at Howard was later, in a sense, Driscoll did an exhibition when he became the chair of the art department at Fisk. And at the Fisk show was so well received at a time when artists and social activists were challenging institutions to be more inclusive. And the Whitney and several museums, not only, in New York, but around the country, were being questioned in terms of what were they doing to show works by artists of color, women artists and artists of color. And the Whitney decided then to feature, Black artists. And Driscoll then proposed that they should do a show of Alma Thomas. And the Thomas show that the Whitney did was very much the show that was at the Fisk Gallery. And they used apparently the same brochure, the similar works. So Driscoll and Thomas had lifelong friendship and influence. They both were abstract artists. They both were interested in nature as a muse for both of them in their work. So thank you, Beverly, for asking that question. I should have put him in as I took him in and out.
Oh, no problem. But what struck me, particularly having seen both shows at the Phillips, yes, Alma's work was everything beautiful. It was absolutely joyous, such joy in all of her work. I just enjoyed every piece that was in the show. While David's work, rather dark, very dark to me.
Well, I can't
And
say
it's
all of
coming
it
from a
was
totally
dark.
different point of view, but it was just
Yeah,
so
some of his pieces
powerful,
were,
but dark. Yeah.
yeah, I think some of his pieces were a bit more challenging in terms of subject matter.
Mhm.
But he also had, well, I guess he was a bit more diverse in theme and in color, even in technique, subject matter, even because he did things that were very, what's the word? That made you think about social issues in a way. The themes that he picked, the way that he portrayed these images. Thomas, even though her early pieces are representational, and even as she begins to experiment with abstraction, there seems to be very few instances where even her colors become darker.
Right.
There are some religious works where you see that, but overall, even when she does things that are related even to natural phenomena where the colors might be darker, the images still come across as a bit more uplifting, maybe.
Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Sure, please.
One of the surprises of the Phillips show for me was the watercolors. I'd seen a lot of her paintings before, but I'd never seen a wide range of her watercolors. And they seem to fall into two categories. They're the smaller works, more informal, which are probably studies for the larger works. But then there are several in the Phillips exhibition, which look like totally finished presentations of works of art in their own right. And I wonder whether there has been any study or exhibition of her watercolors, particularly the more finished ones.
Actually, is it Andrew?
Yeah.
Okay. I would like to see that as well, because I agree, one of the, I won't say revelations, but one of the joys of the Phillips show, or the show that's traveling, I won't say just the Phillips, because even though the Phillips included some things that aren't part of the traveling show, but it was a treat to see that, as many artists do, that she did studies, that, that some of these ideas were very carefully thought out, and that she not only did studies for some of the paintings, but she did watercolors, and she did sculpture, she did prints, that, we see her as a very full artist, unlike, I think, some of the ways that, we tend to kind of pigeonhole, and we want to slot artists in one kind of group. And her large scale abstract, daubs of paint seem to be the way that we want to keep her in that box. But the show shows that, she had a wide range of interests, and she also had a wide range of working techniques. And I know Howard has some watercolors, not many, but we have some works on paper by her, and they are equally as beautiful and evocative. And we know watercolor is very difficult, to control. And when you see that not only is she able to do these sometimes very precise, lines with geometric, patterns in watercolor, and then the ones that are very free and kind of atmospheric and all over. Yeah, I would love to see that. I'd love to also see a little bit more kind of underneath the way that you see it in the paintings. Like, did she do prep work for the watercolors too?
I wonder, the watercolors offer, as they do in general, watercolor as a medium, offers such luminosity. And that's so much a characteristic of her later paintings. And so I think the watercolors, in a way, that's a technique which is so adapted to her artistic interests.
That's true. And also the catalog mentions, and I kind of agree with this, that as she grew older, that she turned more to watercolor, as opposed to working on easel and canvas, because she could work on the table, she could work flat, as opposed to working with something upright. And remember, she's using her kitchen, she's in her home studio without a lot of space, which is still kind of amazing to think about. But that there are, photos taken where you can see that she has things, literally spread out, that she's creating, that it becomes easier to control working flat and working with watercolor. And as you point out, Andrew, that It also gives you then this luminosity that you see in her paintings, as well as the kind of surprise and spontaneity that watercolor provides too.
Gwen, I have some comments from Shelley,
Mhm.
although she could possibly pose her comments herself, but I'll read what she has to say. This has been on my mind, and I have talked to Jonathan Waltz about doing more work on her drawings and works on paper, and possibly looking at her work on paper in relation to Norman Lewis's abstraction. And then she says, there is quite a range to her watercolors too, across her career in terms of stylistic approach, paper types, saturation. So I guess there's a wealth of information there still to be gleaned.
Right, Shelley. In fact, I wish that one might be able to see a show like that with the same attention to detail as the retrospective has, in looking at her early works, her, as you say, middle and late works. I think that that would be a great show to see, because, you know, she she's I don't know, one of the things I like about Thomas is that, you know, she constantly reveals new things
Mhm.
when you look at her work or you think about her, because when you think about the fact that she studied at a vocational school, manual training art school that had a technical curriculum. And apparently early in her career, she wanted to be an architect, and apparently even had one of her architectural drawings shown at the National Gallery, Shelley, which you probably remember. And so there's this interest, even in early thinking, that Herring probably sought her out because of her interest in architecture and her mechanical study. And you can see some of that attention to detail in those early watercolors, those costume designs when she's a student, although she's a mature student. So, I mean, she's not right out of high school, but there's still student work. And so you can see that those very tight, you know, costume studies, and then how things become a bit looser, probably because she becomes more confident in her own ability and perhaps her own view of herself as an artist, as an abstract artist, not, you know, a realist or an artist who's creating representational work. So it would be good to sort of see that, and also to see how she, when she kind of lets go, because there's a control even in the paintings, as you see that she's controlling, you know, where the lines are, she's controlling how she's constructing them, even, you know, pinning the studies onto the canvas. And in watercolor, those of you who've created watercolor know sometimes you can't control it. I mean, you can try, but, you know, sometimes you can't necessarily control what happens with watercolor. So I think that would be a great show, Shelley.
Yeah, I mean, part of what got me thinking about it, as some of you know, is we got this sketch page, this page that seems to be from a sketchbook, that was donated to us last year. And we know of one other page from the sketchbook. And so I've been starting to explore to see if I could assemble, sort of, if I could find other pieces from this disassembled sketchbook. But also we actually have a nice little range now, including a promise gift that was included in the, that isn't on view in the exhibition, that is a from 1977, that's one of her later works, with just the bands of color, and sort of these very abstracted angular lines that sort of suggests some of her interest in trees. And then we have some of the early watercolors where they're very almost impressionistic sort of tree studies. So we have an interesting base in terms of across time to look at with our conservators as well. So I hope it's something that we can look into more, because I think it could be a really interesting aspect. And I talked to Jonathan and Seth when they were working on the show, and they had said that they had really focused, understandably, there's a lot to focus on, and that they had really focused on the technique and working with the Smithsonian Art Museum, American Art Museum curators, since they have such a good stock of Alma Thomas paintings, really focusing on those materials for this show, which I totally understand, but that's okay. It gives us another opportunity to dive into Alma Thomas from a slightly different perspective. And I'm sure there's much more rich information that we can pull out of that, and another beautiful exhibition. So stay tuned. That's all I can say. But I'm glad that Andrew had the same instinct. I hope that puts me in good company.
Yes, it does. So again, I think that there are so many accolades that I'm not going to read them all. So this was fabulous. So well done. Thank you so much, Gwen, for doing this. Really appreciate it. So
Thank you so
on
much.
behalf
for
of the
the
Washington
invitation.
Print Club.
Well, thank you for the invitation. I am very grateful and honored to be here and present on someone who still continues to intrigue us,
Yes.
and how she both lived her life and the work that she created. And I'm hoping those on the call will not only see the show, because it is really a wonderful treat, and a couple of things that I failed to mention that if you saw in that early installation shot, that unlike many installations that only focus on the art, that this one in fact tries to create a sense of what her life may have been like, that a couple of her dresses that she wore have been recreated and a part of the show. And a faculty member, Dr. Elka Stevens, actually created or recreated the dresses that are in the show. So I have to give a plug for her. And also it talks about her life in many different spheres, that she was a member of St. Luke's Episcopal Church, which was not located far from her home. And there she continued this interest in teaching, that she had a club for young people, and she was active in the Y. And Dr. Melanie Harvey contributed an essay about her involvement with St. Luke's as part of the catalog. So I have to give a little bit of a shout for my colleagues at Howard for their contribution to the exhibition. And those who still don't know how to categorize her, I think in a way like Ellington saying she's beyond category, and it may be best to keep her without trying to put her in a category.
Right.
Because the more we learn about her, the more we see she continues to, again, defy the way that we want to play, to view her. Beautiful, elegant, apparently loved to drink too, had scotch in her tea,
That sounds like my kind of person.
didn't mince words, and lived her life, and lived it searching for this elusive beauty at a time when things were very disturbing. And Beverly, as you pointed out, in fact, in a direct message, someone pointed out to me, and I'll share that, it may have been more difficult for Driscoll as a Black man growing up in the South than it may have been for a Black woman growing up in the South. And it may have, and his view perhaps was a bit different. and what he depicts versus Thomas. I think that kind of analytical view, I'll leave that to someone else to search for, because I see Driscoll as being very much a person who lived life in his own terms too. But yet it may have been, that there were certain things that he didn't wish to turn from, that she in a way could turn from, based on her role, based on where she was and how she was interacting. But there are so many things to still consider about her, and even more to come. Shelley's going to work on that exhibition, and I'm hoping that others will continue to read about her, see her work in shows, and keep her legacy alive.
Again, thank you for that additional information. Now I feel like I really know her. I really do. By the way, we live 2 blocks from her house. We're on 13th Street. She's on 15th, was on 15th Street. And I believe that house has finally sold. I don't know. It was up
I
for
wonder,
sale.
I wonder what it sold for, because
$2
I was
million
looking
why
at
it was
Well,
sold.
they were asking 1.2 million.
well, it is a historical
Yes.
property,
Yes, it is.
and I'm hoping that whoever purchased it will know what they are, the spaces that they're
I hope so
in,
too.
and will continue to honor her love for gardens and DC and the community that she embraced.
Well, again, thank you so much. So I'm
Thank
going to
you.
say
Thank
goodbye
you,
to
Gwen.
everyone. Thank
Thank
you
you
all for
all.
joining us.
Good to see you, Chris Beverly.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye,
for
Gwen.
the invitation.
Bye.
Thanks for everybody who's on the
Thank
call,
you,
who I
guys.
didn't get a chance to say hello to earlier. I can't see everyone right now, but all my friends who
A lot of people.
I asked
Lot
to
of
join,
people.
thank you so much for being here. And thanks for your comments.
Thank you, Gwen.
Gwen,
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank you, Gwen.
Bye-bye.
Have a nice day.
Thanks,
Yes.
Linda. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.